I felt like I was the right person at the right time to do it because a lot of people wouldn't be able to handle getting emails of death threats and like all that stuff, but I was able to kind of let it roll off of me and actually use it to make myself even more empowered, or like just to keep going even more, because I had been through that before and it wasn't gonna hurt me.
Hello, my name is Wing, and welcome to A Work in Purpose. Do you see people who are living their purpose and wondering how did they get there? Are you wondering what is your purpose too? Me too. That is why I am inviting you to join me on this journey. A Work in Purpose is our podcast for igniting and reaching our purpose together. Each week, I'll be sharing a podcast episode of me interviewing people from all walks of life who are working towards some kind of purpose, whether it is with the career, volunteering, creativity, spiritual practices, or just how they approach everyday life. We'll dive deep into their stories to uncover what obstacles they had to overcome to get to where they are today. By hearing their stories, I hope you will learn from their journey and be inspired so you too can become a work in purpose. And be sure to subscribe and join our Facebook group and follow us on Instagram for your doses of inspirations. Believe it or not, we all have our own unique story that can change the world, but oftentimes, we either don't know our own story or we are too afraid to share it. Our guest this episode is Mark Snyder. Since he was a child to his adult life, Mark had always been using the power of stories to make a positive impact in the world, to humanize one another, to make the world a more empathetic and compassionate place. In this episode, we discuss how because Mark experienced relentless bullying as a queer teenager growing up in rural Pennsylvania, he had almost taken his own life, yet he survived and eventually thrived. How he then started sharing his own story so other teenagers would not go through what he had to go through in high school. How he then eventually started a queer activist group that garnered him international headlines, as well as death threats. How he had to find out through one of the hardest ways possible that his own dad is also gay. And how he realized his purpose of helping others to find and share their own story too. Hello, Mark Snyder. Welcome to a Work in Purpose podcast. How are you doing?
Great, thank you for having me. I'm honored, and congratulations on this podcast. It's very cool, and I'm thrilled to be among some of your first awesome guests.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you on. So, as you know, the purpose of this podcast is to
Mhm.
help others get inspired to figure out what their purpose is. So, for you, where would you say you are at on your journey towards your purpose? Have you discovered it? Have you reached it? Are you living it? Where are you at?
Well, I think a lot of people have had more than one purpose in my life, and that's okay. You don't have to have one thing that you're going towards all the time. And I think, everyone listening can take a deep breath. If you don't have one thing or like one drive or purpose in life, that's okay. But I have themes in my life at different times in my life, maybe different themes. But one thing that I've been thinking about that really has shown up throughout my entire life, ever since I was a little kid, I have been a storyteller. And I love to hear other people that are good storytellers. And I love to be a part of using stories to impact the world, to make change in the world, to create a more just, fair, and equal world. But also just to bring joy to other people. I love to host parties and tell stories at parties. And I like to help other people tell stories at parties, like, oh, Johnny, tell that story. It makes people feel good to tell them and to hear stories. And it's a part of ancient wisdom, if you think about it. Any religion, any faith, everything from fairy tales to every major religion, the power of stories is present, right? And I've carried that into my career in communications as well. And working in all of my jobs, I've worked to train other people to share stories in their careers or in their activism to make change or to help preserve a brand even. So I just love the power of storytelling.
Speaking of story, what made you understand the power of story? What about your story made you realize that this is my purpose to share stories?
People in my family joke that I should have been a lawyer. They joke but also like I was born kind of an activist. As young as I can remember, I used to share stories and tell stories to make a point or to make a purpose or to change people's minds to alleviate suffering in others or alleviate suffering in the world. It's just I'm kind of cursed with that. I think since I was a little kid, wanting to make change and right the wrongs in the world, and I've learned to soften that, by the way, as I've grown older, and tone down that urge to kind of fight in myself and find more of what they call a middle path in Buddhism. But really, the moment that it really clicked for me was in college when I started to share my story about growing up and being bullied as a queer kid growing up in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. I started to share my story in schools all around Massachusetts. And I went to almost every public high school in Massachusetts, so many of them. And I would go to these schools. This was in like early 2000. So it was 2000, 2001, and so on. And I was still 17 when I went to college, and I immediately started sharing my story. I had told myself, as soon as I get out of rural Pennsylvania, where I grew up, as soon as I get out of there, I'm going to share my story and use my story to make a difference so that other queer kids aren't bullied like I was. And it was extremely therapeutic for me to be able to kind of let it all out and share my story. And it was, I would see the light bulbs go off. There were these kids in the classrooms, kids who you would think, kind of the classic jock, the kid in the class who you think would be the homophobic one. And you would see their light bulb moment when I would share my story. And then at the end of my speaking engagements, they would come up to me and say what a difference it made in them, that they weren't going to, use homophobic language anymore, that they were going to be more kind to their classmates, or that they had never met a gay person before. Many of them, I was the first queer person they met. And that was really awesome. And I just was able to feel and see the power of storytelling every single time. And I also, through that experience, began to understand the power of your own story and the stories that you tell yourself. And I learned how important it was for me not to wallow in a story of being a victim of being bullied in school, but rather being the story be that I was a survivor, that I could inspire the young people, that the bullying made me a stronger person, and using my story to empower myself and others rather than what can be addicting, I think, for many people is the story of victimhood and rehashing that and kind of living in a state of victimhood is unfortunately, I think, addicting to the human mind. And that's something in most religious traditions that we learn to let go of that kind of storytelling where you're attached to an identity, especially an identity of victimhood. So.
Yeah. So you were going to these high schools. What
Mhm.
motivated you to share your story? What was in your story that you felt like you needed to share with these high schoolers?
Well, like I said, I grew up in really, really rural Pennsylvania. I went to a high school that in today's times would be considered Trump country, very right wing. And the bullying that I experienced was extreme. It was intense. It was violent. It was physically and verbally abusive. It was beyond bullying. It was very dangerous experience. And I became very depressed. I became suicidal in early elementary school. The whole school was like 300 kids, and it was 7 to 12th grade. And uh, lucky for me, though, my parents valued compassion and brought me up to have a full understanding of compassion. And I don't know why, but I was lucky enough to even realize at the time that the kids who were bullying me, they were going through a lot of their own stuff. They were experiencing poverty. Many of the kids who bullied me every day, they had to get up at like 4 in the morning and scoop poop on their farms. They came to school smelling like barn poop. They lived tough lives. Like they lived in poverty and scooped poop every morning at 4.
Mhm.
And sometimes I was an outlet for their trauma. There was a lot of trauma in these kind of rural places that are impoverished, and I was able to see that even at a really young age, and I was able to forgive them I think the power of forgiveness is something, again, in almost every faith tradition and also in science, that we know is just really good for everyone to be able to forgive and have compassion towards others. And for whatever reason, I was pretty much able to. Sometimes I got to my wits' end and I would fight back, but just being able to, I just made a promise to myself in about eighth grade that if I made it out of there alive, that I was going to try to change things and make it better for other kids and make it better for others to, if I could prevent one kid from being bullied like I was, then I would feel like I made a difference.
So, if you don't mind me asking or you sharing, how bad did the bullying get?
The bullying increased the older that I got. I still remember the feeling, I can relive it, of kind of waking up in the morning. I would wake up at 6 in the morning to get ready for high school. It would be freezing cold, in the mountain, snow on the ground. My dad could barely drive the car out the lane and down the mountain. The bus would pick me up at the bottom of the mountain, and I was the first kid on the bus. And I used to tell the story that, like, as each kid got on the bus, I actually felt more alone and more afraid because it just meant my risk of being bullied went up. Some days I'd make it all the way to school in the morning without getting bullied on the bus. People just slept, but a lot of times I would have, by the time I even got to school in the morning, I had already been called faggot, had things thrown at me like from behind on the bus. And 90% of the time I would ignore it. Sometimes I would blow up and get in a fight, and then I would get in trouble. So, it was about an hour-long bus ride to pick up all the kids through the valley, over the hills, like, and then finally we would get to school. And then in the morning, I would come into the school, and then there'd be even more kids in there ready to bully me. And if I saw certain ones, I knew what was going to happen. They would kick the back of my heels. They might walk by and push me and call me fag or faggot into my locker. And then, you know, average day, I would arrive. One day I got to my homeroom classroom. We would always kind of gather to do roll call and stuff, and my desk had fag carved in the desk. And then I had fag written in permanent marker on my locker. I had it written on my German project that was in the display case at school. Um, at lunchtime, I had kids that would pray for me. So, I didn't really have any friends that would sit with me at lunch because no one wanted to be around me because they didn't want to deal with the bullying that I was experiencing, or they didn't want to be assumed to be gay themselves or whatever. So I was like just toxic at that point. And there was a group of kids who were right-wing fundamentalist Christians that actually prayed and fasted for me for a while. They saw that I was getting bullied. So on one hand, they were praying that I wouldn't be bullied, but they wanted me to not be gay so that I wouldn't be bullied. So it was kind of that kind of thing. Like the movie Saved, I think, was kind of similar. Um, so I went through that. So I had no friends. I was getting harassed and bullied, and I was receiving death threats in my locker. It was, and being pushed and all of that. In gym class, my clothing was all taken out of my locker, which was unlocked. They took all my clothes, put them in the middle of the shower room. We all had to shower, by the way, without any privacy back then. It was a nightmare. Gym class was just awful. I used to skip it all the time, and the kids, somebody peed all over my clothes and in the middle of the locker room. So I came into gym class one day and found that. And then I remember I quickly left and pretended it didn't happen. I quickly left and I went to the vocal lesson lady, and I went and got a vocal lesson that day. And sometimes I would purposefully like manipulate the schedule and everything so that like I could skip gym and get a vocal lesson, but then they caught on to me. So then I would hide behind the school sometimes to skip gym, and they would call my name, like, Mark, come down to the office. Where are you? That kind of thing. So I received punishment kind of often. What I needed was help and support, and what I was receiving was punishment. I was given detention, talked to. At one point, there was like this group therapy thing they were trying out at the school, like a little pilot program. And I remember I went there and I talked a little bit about my bullying, and the guidance counselor was giving me tips on how to act more tough and to fight back. But it was like hello, anytime I would fight back, I would get in trouble and get detention. Like none of their tips were working. And they actually went around the room and asked people if they saw me being bullied and what they felt about it. Then I had to sit there and listen to these girls literally cry with tears about how bad they felt when they saw me being bullied. But there was no one had a solution. There was no team to support me or change anything. It was really just terribly more traumatic. So by the time eighth grade hit, at that point, I was getting pretty severely depressed. I was skipping school. My parents were getting notifications that if I missed any more school, they would be in trouble. They would legal trouble. So I started going to the doctor. I pretty much always had a sinus infection of some sort anyway, so I pretty much could get a doctor's note anytime I wanted. So I had a long list of creative ways to get out of going to school, and I missed a lot of school. My grades definitely suffered, but I was able to keep them up good enough. It wasn't super hard. I was able to get B's pretty easily at that in that school. They certainly didn't value college education, and most of the kids were not interested in leaving that rural area. Um, my number one goal was to get out, but as the depression increased, I started contemplating suicide and became pretty suicidal. Only things kind of keeping me alive were like my mom and dad, close family, and then having the internet and being, one of the only kids in my class with access to the internet, which of course was super slow dial up, but I had some access to the gay chat rooms and stuff where I learned I wasn't alone in the world. And that kind of really saved my life. I had some low points where I held my dad's gun to my head. Um, we lived in a gun culture, there were guns everywhere. Yeah, so I would walk through the school during the day, like when my classes would switch, I would go into the hallway. There were kids that would push me into the locker and pretend to rape me and ask me really vulgar questions. And um, I got in fistfights. There was one boy, we had a punching match back and forth. There was one day in particular that was especially difficult. And I remember riding the bus home. This time, when you ride home, I'm the first one on in the morning, the last one off in the afternoon. So as each kid got off the bus, I actually felt a little safer. But my dad forgot to pick me up at the bottom of the mountain that day. He had an appointment, and I walked home up the mountain. It was a good strong walk going up the mountain to my house, but it was doable through the woods. And that day, I was just so depressed and kind of in a daze, and I remember kind of feeling numb and going straight to my dad's side of the bedroom, my mom and dad's bedroom, straight to his closet, got his handgun out of a box that he kept on the top shelf, not locked. I took it out, I loaded it, and I sat on the edge of my parents' bed and I held the gun to the side of my head. And I remember everything that I thought that went through my head. That I remember everything that went through my head at that moment. Like, I remember thinking how afraid I was to pull the trigger and how badly I really wanted to, and how badly I just wanted to end this all and be free and released from the bullying and trauma and violence. And I just couldn't take it anymore. And I wasn't out as gay, and I couldn't be comfortable. And just the violence was too much. And I felt like this was probably the only way out. Un- at the time, I felt like it was unfortunate. I felt too afraid to pull the trigger because I was worried that I would not die and then like mess up and be like mentally messed up or something and then still be alive. And so, really, that kept me from pulling the trigger. And also, the other thing that kept me from pulling the trigger was feeling like I didn't want to let my parents suffer the rest of their lives or feel sad for them. But it was so close. I've never been as close to suicide as that moment. The next couple of days, I um, soon after that, I came out to my mom in the car and told her everything that was happening. I broke down crying after a comment my grandma made, which I don't even remember what it was, but I broke down crying in the car on the way home. And then I told her that yes, I was gay when she asked. And because I told her what was happening in school and how bad it was, she didn't really know. They knew that I hated school, but they didn't really know the extent of the bullying until I broke down in the car and told my mom. And then she said when we got home, we should tell my dad, and we did. They, of course, were very accepting. I told them in that moment, I told them I was not going to go back to school anymore and that I was going to quit going to school as soon as I turned 16 and that that was the end of school for me. Because I think at the time in Pennsylvania, you didn't have to graduate high school if you didn't want to. You could basically you could quit when you were a certain age. And I was like, that's my plan. And they were like, no, you're not doing that. You're still going to college. You're going to switch high schools. So we began searching for other high schools, and there were no good options. Really, there was a lot of right-wing Christian schools, private schools, homeschool, things. My parents didn't want to homeschool me, but there were some local people that would do it. So we ended up switching me to a public high school that was about an hour drive away in a college town. So I started going there. My mom would drive me in the morning on her way to work. Once I got my driver's license, I started driving myself. The bullying was decreased probably 65% at the new school. I was still the only one that was clearly gay, and I did come out to a couple of people. It was a college town, so it was a little more liberal, but of course, you got to remember this is still really rural Pennsylvania. I received death threats on my car, like die fag on my car windshield. I actually still received some things on my locker. This was a common form of bullying back then, I guess. And still got called fag in the hallways or out. I didn't go to sports games. I didn't socialize too much with my classmates. After school, I would drive the hour back home to the mountain and just, again, take refuge in the nature and peacefulness of the mountain. And I stayed as focused as I could on going to college, and I made a plan to go to college early. And that's when I researched how to go to college early. And um,
So, were your parents the first people you came out to?
the first people I came out to were other gay people on internet chat rooms. Then I think the next person was my mom.
Wow. Can you talk more about what it was like to build up that courage to come out to someone close to you in your family?
I don't know if it was the courage or the desperation because it was life or death at that point.
Hmm.
It I either it was either die or tell her like exactly what was going on in school. And then when she said, "Well, are you gay?" I said, I think so, yes." And if they hadn't accepted me, I probably would have ran away or actually followed through with the suicide, I guess, because it was really just at the edge. There was no going back at that point because
Hmm.
it was just so bad. The bullying was so bad in school at that point.
Yeah.
Like it had to change. Yeah.
When she said
Um,
when she said that you should tell your dad too, what was going through your mind at that time?
well, then I was like, now I have to like go home and go through that again. And so we did that. Um, I can remember my dad being kind of nervous and fidgety when I was coming out, and when he was very accepting. And my dad's brother is gay and had been for a long time, so I had a gay uncle, and he was like, Uncle Dan's gay. We don't talk about it. So that was part of the discussion when I came out. And then it really switched after 10 minutes of like, okay, they'll accept it. Like we'll get through this. It became more of like, let's make a plan now in terms of schooling. It was more about what do we do about the immediate term to keep you safe, but also they made it more about like how do we get you to college and focused on your education, which was great. I mean, that was so important to have something to focus on, like education, and like have that goal of succeeding and getting out of there and having success. And it was even though I was suicidal around that time and very depressed, I already was able to start thinking like, oh, when I get out of here, I want to make it better for other kids, because I knew this was happening to other kids in probably where I lived. It was certainly happening to the one girl in my class that was of color. And so I made it. I was already starting to think about like, oh, when I get out of there. So that, having goals and being able to think about my future with the support of my parents really, really helped me survive.
That's great. So when you did go to college, what was that
Yes.
first month or two like for you to go from that
Yeah.
environment to that to you went to Boston for college? What was that like?
Right. When I was 16, I took the SAT, and then I applied to Emerson College. And then when I was 17, they accepted me, and I was in 11th grade, and they allowed me to attend college without completing high school. So I didn't have to get a high school graduation. I got to go early because I wrote an essay to them about everything I was going through in school. I was being bullied, and they gave me a chance, and it was awesome. It was life-saving. So packed up my bags, and we drove the 7 hours to Boston, and I got there. I remember the first day of college, we wore Al Gore t-shirts. It was 2000. It was height of the presidential election. It was like a time capsule looking back on it of this like weird moment. So, I couldn't vote yet, but I was very enthused about Al Gore becoming the president and being kind of pro-gay at the time. And I knew that I was about to like come out and blossom into my full gay self in college when I got to the big city. And that's what happened. Although the first week was just the culture shock of going from living deep, deep in the woods to now living in a dorm that is in the center of a city was like like it was really culture shock. It was just like, oh, like I can go next door and get a latte. Like, wow, I'm so cool. I can get a soy latte. How cool. And like there were people of color when I would walk out the door, and there were queer people everywhere, and there were a lot of queer people that were way more comfortable in their sexuality and their gender identity and all of that than I was, and I wasn't used to that at all. With my uncle, he didn't talk about it at all. So I had never really been around anyone that was totally like comfortable with themselves. And so I immediately got involved in the queer group at the college, but then I also got involved in community groups outside of college. The speakers bureau I went to, because I was already kind of into public speaking and feeling like, oh, this could be something I could be good at, even though it made me really nervous. And that's where I met other queer people. And then they told me about the Boston Alliance of LGBTQ youth, and I started going there, and it was very therapeutic. I got to meet other young LGBTQ people, ages 22 and under. So I was 17. I was kind of like the middle range age there, and it was very cool to be able to help younger kids on their journey, but also meet older ones that were more comfortable. And the community was just really awesome. I met my first transgender person that I ever met was at that organization, and she is still to this day the executive director of that organization. Her name is Grace, and she might be the oldest, longest running transgender executive director, and she's helped so many queer kids be able to find comfort in themselves, and they call her Mother Grace. So, and she's still doing it. So it was a really important magical time going to the big city and meeting all kinds of people, and also just experiencing like all kinds of food and just all the diversity of everything that the city brings. It was all new. I was very wide-eyed, like Emily in Paris, just like, ready to explore and learn. And I learned how to use chopsticks, like
So,
everything that a mountain kid needs to experience. I got to do it. So
yeah. So what was your emotional state? Because so you went from being depressed, being from rural Pennsylvania, to going to this, place where you can be yourself. Did you have to go through some sort of transition where you felt
yes.
comfortable and happy? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it was awkward. But I'm so grateful that I was able to find such amazing friends that I'm still friends with today, actually, that lived on my floor of my dorm. I purposely signed up for a special floor of my dorm because I knew that going into it, I was going to be like weird mountain kid, like, and coming out and all that. And so I chose this, they had themed dorm floors, and the floor I chose was called Star Floor, which stood for students taking active roles. And you had to volunteer, you had to do volunteer work with other kids. And so we we volunteered with different things in the community together, and so that was like built camaraderie. And there were other LGBTQ kids, and of course we snuck alcohol, and I got really drunk for the first time, like the first week of college. And that night, it really it opened up the floodgates for me. I got drunk and I just started talking about what I had been through and how I made it to this college. And it had been built up for years of the bullying and like me just being determined and focused on getting the hell out of there and surviving, that the moment I was drunk, it just opened it up and I started sobbing. And I didn't even know these kids, and I was like shaking and sobbing, crying, and they were like, "What the hell is going on with this kid?" And then I just started pouring it all out. I had to go, they took me to my room and I like laid down on my bed and I was crying for hours. And two of my friends, who are still my two of my very best friends to this day, were there and like talked me through a lot of it, all night long. And I just told them about how bad the bullying was, and like how, and I was also terrified because if I didn't get good grades that year in college, then I would have been sent back to
Mm.
Pennsylvania without a high school degree, a diploma. So I would have had to go back to high school and complete my diploma if I didn't do well in college. So I was still felt all this pressure, like I made it here, but now I have to be able to, and I was like really worried, like, are the college courses going to be so over my head because I went to these rural schools that were like not really into college preparation, and I wasn't even in the like, what's it called, the accelerated classes or anything. So I was just really nervous, but I think that pressure helped me again stay like focused, and you know, um, I got the best grades of my college career that year because
Mm.
it was like I had to complete
Yeah.
I had to complete my high school diploma using my college courses that year, and if it was again life or death, I had to stay.
What
And
was it
then
like to get your first like annual grade from your college?
it was such a big relief, and I felt really, really proud, and I felt like, yeah, I just felt like, okay, I'm gonna be okay, and I'm doing it, and I felt in charge of my life for the first time. Like I could relax a little bit and celebrate and not feel that sense of like, oh my God, I can't go back there.
So, when you were in college, how did you get selected to go to these schools and tell your story? How did you get started?
First, I joined the Speak Out Speakers Bureau. So I did a training there on how to tell my story. And then they would email around, after you were trained, they would email around opportunities. And then I would just sign up for them and go. One of the organizations that I got involved with in Boston was PFLAG, and they're an amazing organization. And I have to give a shout out to the executive director of that organization who invited me to be on their board. The two of us used to go around to the schools and do our storytelling in Massachusetts. We actually had funding from the state to do it in anti-bullying work. And that experience really was so therapeutic and really changed my life, and also was one of those aha moments of the power of storytelling, of course. And she was a lesbian who came out kind of later in life. And so she would tell her story to the kids, and I would tell my story about being bullied. And sometimes we would be telling our stories in front of like the whole school, like the whole auditorium would come. Or sometimes it would be like 5 classes in a day. So we would do our story, and we would help the kids think about how to be better allies to LGBTQ students, or how to make their school better. So we would like share our stories, and then we would do Q&A, or we would give them language to use around LGBTQ issues. And so, but some days we would do like 5 or more in a row. And like we had to listen to each other's story again and again and again when we would do that. And it was so exhausting sometimes to have to relive my bullying story, the one that I just told you. I would have to tell that 10 times in a day and then like go home and make dinner. And I would be so drained after telling my story that much. And I started to get a little numb to it. But I would try to like change it up or spice it up, you know, with different details of my life, or tell it differently, or paint the picture differently each time. But her name was Pam, and Pam, you know, I view her as like a very close friend that I carry with me. We don't talk that often, but I carry her with me in my heart because she was such an important friend and mentor to me as I was growing into my adulthood and telling my story.
So, what
Yeah.
made you decide to sign up for Speak Out? Did someone nudge you, or you just were just curious? How that happened?
I think I saw a flyer for it, or I learned about it through the gay group at my college, and it was like LGBTQ Speakers Bureau, like make a difference, like share your story type of thing. And I was like, oh, that sounds right up my alley. I had just, I was really into public speaking, and it was like exactly the right fit for like what I wanted to do. And it was also just another opportunity to meet other queer people outside of my college environment. Like I wanted to meet people to date. I wanted to meet new friends. And in fact, one of the people that I sat down next to at that speakers bureau, we're still friends today. And it's just because I sat down next to him, and we're still really good friends today.
So, for your audience in high school, what sort of message did you want them to gather from your story?
Yeah, when I would go around to the high schools, I also spoke at colleges, corporations, things like that. I would share my story. And I would just want them to take away a better understanding of what a queer person is, that we're all human, that we're not just, I think that the othering of people, when you meet someone, when you talk to them, it's a lot harder to other them. And I saw that going on where I grew up a lot. There was a lot of racism and anti-immigrant sentiments as well in my hometown. And the people there really never met an immigrant person, or many of them had never even met a person of color. So my goal was to just eliminate or reduce that kind of othering so that when I left, they would be more kind to each other.
If you haven't gone through what you had to go through in high school, would you say that your purpose would still be to tell stories, or did you need to go through something like that for your story to be more purposeful?
I'm really not sure. I feel like I would still be helping other people share their stories and improve their communication skills in order to make a difference in their own life and others. Um, Maybe, but I'm definitely weirdly grateful for my experience growing up and all of it, from the isolation of the mountain to the beautiful nature to the bullying. Like it all, it's such a rich life and a unique life that I've lived already at 38, going on 38 years old. Like I feel like I've lived several lives, and I'm so grateful for the uniqueness of it all, the drama of it all. Um, I always kind of felt like I was living my life like I was watching a movie in some way. Like, wow, this is quite a story. But yeah, like, going through that definitely made me stronger. It made me more empathetic than I already was, and it gave me the substance to be able to tell my own story and make a difference in other people's lives for sure. But also just, yeah, I mean, I was a storyteller no matter what, though, because even before all of that happened, I was telling the story of animals that were suffering and trying to, make a difference for the lives of animals even before I was telling my own story. So I think the storytelling part was in my blood, but the experience that I went through in terms of the bullying, um, I never felt like, gosh, I wish that had never happened to me. I always felt grateful that it happened to me because it made me stronger and gave me the tools to make a difference for other people.
Yeah. What kind of advice would you give to teenagers who might be going through that nowadays?
Luckily, the internet is a lot more established now, so they can definitely reach out and find community online like I did. And, that saved my life, and I believe it's still saving millions of other young people's lives that are feeling isolated. So the first thing is to find resources online and connect with community online in a safe way. And then the second thing is to find your support in real life, whether it's one teacher, one friend, one parent. There's somebody out there. There's one person. Like, even if you're in the most isolated place, there is going to be one person that you can find. It might be the liberal church in town, the Unitarian church in town. It might be, the local Starbucks where you meet the gay barista and say hi and like ask, if you want to hang out. Like find that one person to start with, and then you really feel like, okay, I'm not alone. Not not feeling alone as a concept, like it's a nice concept, but like you really have to live it and feel it. And so that means like you really actually do have to make that one friend or that one connection You don't, it can't just be like out there that you're imagining it. You have to really feel it. So that's step one is one, make one strong connection. And then when you make a connection, tell your story, say how you feel, share your story, and that will help yourself and it will help others. So that's my key advice. And make a plan and don't do drugs because I can tell you if I had gotten into drugs and alcohol at that age when I was that depressed, I don't think I would have made it. And I experimented a lot with drugs and alcohol in college and after college, a little bit too much. And I look back and I think, oh my gosh, good thing I didn't do that when I was in high school, because if you had combined my depression and all of that with alcohol and drugs back then, I can easily see my life going in a very different direction. So just hold off on experimenting with drugs and alcohol until you're a little older, your brain is a little more mature. Um, yeah, I sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but I'm telling you, the drugs and alcohol will mess up your teenage years if you let it, and then like that just like really takes you off path. Wait until you're in college or older and then experiment in a safe way.
Thank you for sharing that advice. Very sage, wise, lived advice.
Also, of course, meditate. Of course, meditate. Number one, always
Yes, everyone should meditate.
practice gratitude and meditate.
So, going back to the concept of sharing stories, now that I've heard you talk more about it, it sounds like the deeper purpose is to humanize everyone and to make us all aware that we're all humans and we all have things in common and trauma we've overcome or something positive in our lives that bonds us together. Would you say that is correct?
I think that is correct. I haven't totally thought about it that way, but definitely that we're all connected, that we all have something in common. We have what we call shared values. In my career, when I'm interviewing for a new job or when I'm talking about what I do for my career, I will often say I'm a values-based communicator. And so one of the ways that I like to make change or have people feel connected to others is by grounding the story in shared values, those shared values that most of us have, like wanting to be treated nicely or fairness or, you know, being rewarded for a job well done or whatever the case may be. And that's when I worked in the LGBTQ activism world, we would often use stories of different people and ground those stories in one or two of those values that many people share so that they could relate to one another. I think that's definitely part of it. I always tell people that I'm the most weird person, but like you could drop me down in the middle of anywhere in the world, and I think I could find a way to chit chat with people and find something in common with them. And I learned that in part from my dad. He was a very chatty, social person, and I would follow him along on his appointments for work or to the grocery store, and he would just chit chat with anyone. Sometimes they would embarrass me, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot from that because I can do that now too. And I think it's fun to smile to strangers and chit chat with people, especially when you travel. There's something so rewarding about that.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so hard for people to know what their story is and to be able to share it with others on a real human to human level?
It really is. People aren't brought up, I think, especially in American culture, to share stories the way that maybe other cultures are, and people aren't brought up to share their story, or if they do, like I said before, it's about being a victim or the trauma that happened to them. And I know that's my example, but actually, I haven't been sharing that bullying story really that much since that time in college. I did it for 4 years and it was so awesome and powerful, but that's not what I dwell on. I don't want that to be my full identity as a human. But we all have many stories to tell. We all have a story. Everyone has many stories to tell. And I think, and I love to help bring it out of people. I like to do what I call play Oprah. So at work, when I'm working with somebody to go tell their story in the media or tell their story about why they do what they do, like at work, I've helped some of our people on our diversity group at work tell the story of how certain things came about, such as clothing that matched people's skin tones and things like that. And I love to play Oprah to like hear more and more about like, well, how did it come about? well, we put the fabric against the skin tones and we did this and that, but okay, but like what inspired you? And then eventually it's like, well, when I was a kid, I could never find any clothing that matched my skin tone. And my mom said, my mom always filled the house with black Santa, as one of my coworkers said, and because I could never find that in my life. So once you kind of play Oprah with someone, there you can find a way to bring out the core, the really powerful story. And then I'm like, okay, there it is. That's the key. Like, let's bring that story forward when we tell this to be, the news outlet that you work with or whoever. So it's just it's really fun exercise, and people love to be heard and
Mhm.
validated, and it feels good all around.
Yeah, nice. So let's say, someone has a victimhood story that they've been telling themselves their whole life. What should they do instead to change that story?
I think number one is to focus on the survival aspect on it, and focus on what you're grateful for in life. The power of gratitude is widely studied and proven to be transformational. So, step one to flip out of that is to ask yourself what you're grateful for, whether it's something you're grateful for in that trauma that you grew from or learned from, or whether it's something you're just grateful for right now, whether it's the nice weather or whatever. But literally counting your blessings, as they would say growing up in rural America, they always would say, count your blessings. I
Yeah.
also was very impacted as a kid. My aunt, she ran a foster care agency, an adoption agency, and she brought me to a seminar on choice theory, or what was called reality therapy. And basically, it was just cut the BS, don't wallow in the past. Focus on the now and what you can do right now, and focus on your path and what's next, and your plan to change or to do what's next. And sometimes people just need to be told to cut it out. Um, I think one of the downfalls of kind of the woo-woo circles that maybe some of us traverse in sometimes, I do. I enjoy a good breathwork class and a yoga class and a little spiritual ritual that's very LA. And I think sometimes those of us in those circles can get caught up in rehashing our trauma, identifying with the trauma, the victimhood, and like always seeking out another thing and another thing and another thing to soothe the trauma. And sometimes I think people just need to be told to cut it out. Enough is enough. This is not your identity, and you've got to move on. That you've got to stop that. And actually, it was a Taoist, what do you call him? A Taoist leader, I'll call him, that I visited with in Hawaii a couple of months ago. I went to this Taoist temple that I had felt obsessed over for whatever reason. I found it on Yelp, and I went to him, told him a little bit of my life story. He asked why I was there and everything. And I was just kind of seeking guidance in life and wanted to experience this. And he told me to stop rehashing trauma and stop attaching to the trauma in the past, because you kind of relive it out in different ways in your current life. We all do in some way. We all have things that happen to us in our childhood, or different dynamics in our childhood that we grew up with, and then we like live them out in our current day. So you just gotta interject sometimes with your brain and say, cut it out.
What if that person gets some sort of reward for having that victimhood story? Like their identity feeds off it and they enjoy the attention because that's
Hmm.
how they get attention. In that case,
I
what's
noticed that
that?
happening for myself. I was receiving a lot of attention telling my horrible story and making people cry. And on one hand, it felt really good, like I was making people feel emotion to make a difference in the world, and try to change their schools, to change the policies in their schools to be more LGBTQ friendly and stuff like that. And I was getting awards, from youth LGBT organizations, and being asked to go on the local news and all sorts of things like that. And I could see that happening, but I kind of caught it when it was happening in my brain. Like, I'm not going to allow this to be my full story. But we live in a culture, I think, especially in the United States, that does reward that victimhood mentality sometimes a little too much. You've just I don't have the magic answer, but you've got to catch it. And I think sometimes people, one way to do it is just to disconnect and get into nature and breathe and just the basics. Like, get into nature, breathe, practice gratitude, just like the core basic things of every major faith. Be kind to others. Service to others is the number one thing. If you want to change a couple of things, if you want to get out of that cycle in your head, like play with puppies or cute animals or go volunteer with animals or with humans, homeless shelter, giving back, serving others, doing things for others, it really like it helps take away your ego. It helps with your brain chemicals feel more calm and at ease. And it's a big part of Buddhism is kind of practicing loving kindness towards others and being of service to others to help reduce suffering. And I think that's really the way to do it.
Yeah. So you mentioned that throughout your career, you've been using the power of stories to affect positive change. Can you share one story of maybe in your professional career where you helped someone figure out their story and be able to feel empowered by sharing it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so many in the nonprofit sector, which I worked in for 15 years with LGBTQ people. I empowered LGBTQ youth, parents of LGBTQ youth, LGBTQ parents. I kind of worked all across the spectrum of the community for a long time. But especially at Transgender Law Center, I worked with one transgender young person who went through a lot of trauma in school, and she transitioned from male to female in school, and then her mom supported her. She became prom queen. She became, rode in the pride floats of parades. And I really worked with her and both her and her mom to work on their story, to be able to share it, to focus on the shared values, to show the power of a mother loving her trans child. And the two of them together and also separately continued on sharing their stories and making such a big impact. They were in all sorts of media outlets. They they were they were speakers at lots of events because they were so charming and loving, and they had gone through a lot of challenges together but came out on the other side, and there was just so much love. And for parents who were struggling to accept their trans kid, that was really powerful to them for them to see. And then for other trans kids to see the young woman, it was really powerful for them to see her too. And she's been on reality shows since then and everything.
Wow.
So I was kind of there at the beginning, helping her formulate her story. And hopefully it kind of, it built the foundation for her to continue building and sharing her storytelling skill set to the point where she became quite a well-known young trans activist.
Mm. So for your professional career, you used the power of story. How did you get into that career? You've had some media skills. Where did that come from?
Well, it was in my blood. I wrote my first press release when I was about 13 or 14 years old. And that was a press release about protesting the circus that was coming to town. Once I was in college for just a few months and I started telling my story and kind of connecting to the activist communities there in Boston where I went to school, that's when I started to realize that the marketing and public relations major I had kind of randomly chose was going to be a really great fit for me, and that I was going to use that in the nonprofit world. And throughout college, I kind of forged my own path. Most of the other kids would be assigned to rebrand Nike or rebrand whatever, or help this corporation out of a crisis. And I would always ask the professor, could I please do the same project except use the local nonprofit as my case study? And they would often allow me to do that. So I did that many times throughout my college career. And and really and I also was doing the activism and volunteering work while I was in college at the same time. And then once I graduated college, went right into working for the Boston Alliance of LGBTQ youth. And that was really the beginning of my career. I made $26,000 a year or something. Like looking back, I'm like, I don't know how I survived in Boston on like this like fresh out of college nonprofit salary, but I did it, made it work.
Yeah, but before all that, during college, you were able to use the media and storytelling very successfully to get your activist voice out there. Can you tell us more
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I founded queertoday.com, which is stagnant now, but for a good 5-year, 6-year run, it was kind of the premier leftist LGBTQ activist group out of Boston. We made worldwide headlines for our publicity stunts and and storytelling and activism.
Yeah, at the time in Boston, it made quite a splash. It was often featured on the local gay newspaper. How did you come up with the inspiration to start queertoday.com back then? And what was your driving force? And where'd you get that courage from back then?
I don't always know where I got the courage from because that was in me since I was a little kid, that drive. I would always speak up when I felt like something was unfair. I would argue with my parents about everything. When we would ride home from church, after church on Sundays, I would immediately question everything the pastor said and we would argue about Christianity. I have since drawn a lot of lessons from my Christian upbringing, by the way, but I never identified with it. I never fully was like a believer in all of this stuff. But I've always been kind of a courageous fighter, and I don't know where it comes from entirely. I will say that my experiences in high school made me more courageous and just being different. I mean, I couldn't help it. I was always really different, and my gender identity and expression were always really different. I was very gender non-conforming. I always felt like more of a feminine spirit, or like I was a strong person, but my strength came from my feminine side more so. And just feeling different all the time, you kind of have to learn to be tough, or you fake it until you make it sometimes as well. There was a lot of faking it till you make it. It's a good lesson in life. It really works sometimes. and and just you break through that wall sometimes. I have a lot of anxiety, even social anxiety, even though I love people, but I imagine that wall and then breaking through it, and you just have to break through it sometimes, and then it feels really good. But there were times in Boston where I was like the most hated queer activist ever. Like a lot of people really didn't like me from the mainstream LGBT world, but also the right wing. And I was a target. I was getting phone calls until 5 in the morning. I was invited on right wing radio shows, and I would always go on. I never declined an interview. I would always go on these far right wing interviews, and they were very combative. I would get death threats. But honestly, I was kind of used to that because I got death threats in high school. So that was nothing to me. And like I felt like I was the right person at the right time to do it, because a lot of people wouldn't be able to handle getting emails of death threats and like all that stuff, but I was able to kind of let it roll off of me and actually use it to make myself even more empowered, or like just to keep going even more, because I had been through that before and it wasn't gonna hurt me.
So starting Queer Today, like you just had an idea to start a blog at the time, or did you want to start an activist group?
I wanted to start an activist group for sure. The first protest was a kiss in the Catholic Archdiocese in Boston. And the reason why we framed a kiss in was because at that time the Catholic Church was going to read an anti-gay statement from the pulpit in every single Catholic church in Massachusetts. So we showed up, we organized online, we showed up, we did the gay kiss and all of that, and it got a lot of media attention. And then the group grew from there. And of course, at that time, the mainstream gay rights group was horrified and very angry that I organized that protest, because they thought that it would jeopardize their kind of efforts to be mainstream. And one of the reasons why I founded Queer Today at the time was because I had a very different mentality. I had no interest in convincing the public that I was normal and just like them, so-called normal. I'm much more proud of our differences. So just because I like to use storytelling to draw out our shared humanity does not mean that I think it behooves queer people or any other community to try and falsely or fakely assimilate and say we're just like you, we're normal, we're just like you, and tamp down the true diversity of the community. I hated that, and I wanted I wanted to be proud of being different and proud of being queer. I felt like at the time I felt like the gay rights movement was trying to hide away the drag queens and the trans people and the gender nonconforming people, to try and paint this image of the all-American, normal community, which it felt disingenuous to me, and I felt excluded from it, and I wanted to create something a little more bold and proud.
Yeah, you sure created something bold with that kissing. I remember before I met you, I think I saw a newspaper article about it. I was like, oh wow, can't believe they did that. So
Yeah.
what was it like the day after that or the day of when you were getting all of this media attention? And you were so young. Like, how did you handle all of that?
Well, luckily, I was pretty trained in public speaking. I had given a lot of speeches. I had been speaking at all those schools, remember? And so I was ready to speak. We practiced our talking points. I had them written out. We practiced together as a group. It was very prepared and organized. But that day, we walked out of the church and the media cameras were waiting outside, ready to go. And then it was a lot of adrenaline. I was awake a lot, and then I kind of crashed after a little while. But there were many, many media interviews. There were debates. I was on the Laura Ingraham show. She has a Fox News channel now, or sorry, a Fox News show now, but she had a radio show back then, and I was on there debating a
Mm.
Catholic activist in front of a huge crowd of people. And so there was just a lot going on, and many, many, many interviews in addition to the death threats and all of that. It was just the height of it. The media was worldwide. We were young. It was exciting. It was fun. People were, in the community were having dinner with me, telling me to tone it down, to calm down. They didn't want me to jeopardize their fight for gay marriage. It was just a very exciting time, and it was scary but fun, and we got through it. I don't regret it. It was so fun, and I'm really proud of everything that we did back then. And I'm a little bit sad that we didn't keep the organization going, or that I wasn't able to like pass the torch to other leaders. I tried, but at the same time, nowadays there's so much good activism going on all around the country and in Boston, and like I said, that was kind of a phase in my life, but I use a different energy now in making change in the world, and I'm much more focused on bringing joy to people and bringing joy to myself and joy to other people and helping people share their stories. I'm still very passionate and political. Anyone that sees my Facebook knows that, but in my normal daily life and my energy is a lot less agitated and a lot less full of righteousness and anger. And I guess I've accepted to some degree that the world is not fair, and I have not succumbed to that. But the reality is, life isn't fair. Life is suffering, as they say in Buddhism. There is going to be suffering, and um, for me, for my own mental health, I needed to kind of take a little bit more of a soothing approach to life for now. That's not to say I won't show up at a protest now and then, but being in the fighting mode all the time, can only last so long. And so I've kind of chosen some other aspects of activism, such as being on the board of directors for for a nonprofit for mostly immigrant families, or helping people share their stories, or donating or whatever. Like there's other ways now that I'm making change that are just as valid, but that are better for my own mental health for now.
Is there like a particular point when you realized that the activism energy that you were having, were feeling agitated, wasn't leading you down a path that was good for your self-care, or was it like a slow realization?
I think I always saw it. I always knew. I did try to do self-care, and then I would still get distracted by media requests or opportunities to protest things. At the time, I was very driven to protest all the time. And it was fun and it was great. And then I eased out of it, I guess. But people get burnt out. It's a common problem in any movement, or anyone that's passionate in any career. Even sometimes people get kind of burnt out. And so even though I was doing yoga here and there and trying different self-care things and all of that, like I still, it just, I don't want to say I grew out of it, because people can get involved in and out of direct activism or protests at any time in their life. And actually, a couple years ago, last year, I organized a protest in the Castro here in San Francisco. But it's kind of something I get involved in maybe every couple years now, or I get involved not as the leader, but as a person that joins in. It feels so good to join in and not be the one organizing it nowadays. It's kind of a relief. I like when there's another leader there to just take the reins and I can join in as a participant sometimes. But I don't think there was one specific moment that I realized I needed to shift things that I can remember. But I definitely just it built up the where I started to feel like, okay, it's time for me to change. And then also when I moved to San Francisco, I kind of, started a new life out here on the West Coast. So
So after college, after living in Boston, you moved to San Francisco, ready to live this new life. But then
yeah,
something happened. What was that
yeah.
thing that happened that changed
Well,
your life again?
yeah, I outgrew Boston and I was sick of the winter and ready for California life. And I think it was within a few weeks of moving to San Francisco, my mom called at like 3 in the morning and said, Mark, your dad is missing. And I was like, what? Um, but immediately thing that ran through my head was my dad either got in a car accident or committed suicide, um, or like ran off with another man because I had always known or felt that my dad was also gay. And so as soon as my mom said my dad was missing, I thought I would have to do with something about him being gay. Like that's the first thing I thought. And he was missing for a full 3 days. And during that time, I mean, it was really difficult emotionally, like not knowing what was going on. By the third day, I started to accept that he probably wasn't going to be found and that maybe he was dead. Um, I called out of work, obviously, like I can't come into work. My dad is missing. And then finally, they found out that he had been arrested in a sting designed by the police to entrap men who have sex with men and pay for that sex. And during that time, when he was arrested, he paid bail, but then fled, and got all the way to Florida, South Florida. He got on a bus all the way to Florida, and he became very paranoid along the way. Because he hadn't eaten at that point in a couple days, he became very paranoid. He was running around South Florida, and then the police found him swimming in a canal, completely delusional. He had, I believe, attempted to commit suicide and failed. And then he was in the hospital, and so they found him, notified my mom about it. My mom notified me. So I kept trying to call the hospital so that I could speak with him. And I finally got through to a nurse who let me speak with him, kind of breaking the rules, I guess, because he was technically under arrest at that time, but they were taking care of him in the hospital. And I just remember saying, Dad, I know you're gay. Please don't kill yourself. I can't handle that. I can't go through that right now. Like, just stay strong. We're going to figure this out. And he basically was like, okay. And I could hear him crying and he hung up. It was, I think, several days before I heard from him again. At that point, we began communicating via letters. He was in a jail in Miami then, uh, and my dad was in a very high security jail at first because he was a flight risk. He was put in a paper robe. He was also a suicide risk in the jail. So they put him in a paper robe in a very cold jail cell. He slept on like a metal bed. It was very cold with cold air flowing down on him, he said. And he has a lot of little anecdotes. They he believes they purposely put him in with a black guy with big muscles. He believes they did that on purpose to intimidate him, and the guy was actually pretty intimidating. But um, my dad and I are very similar in this way. I learned this kind of bonding where we can chat with anybody type of spirit from my dad, and he began to talk with the man about Christianity, and the jail's plan backfired because my dad and his cellmate would sing Amazing Grace and other hymns together until the day came when my dad was released from that jail and then put in a van, handcuffed behind his back and feet also tied, and taken in the van all the way back up to Pennsylvania, where he was then in a county jail, collapsed in the county jail without medicine. I'm learning all of this through letters from him back and forth. And then he made it to a better jail where he was for the rest of the time. During the letter writing back and forth with him, I, of course, was trying to offer him all the wisdom I could. And he came out officially as gay in a letter to me, said, I think I'm gay. This has been going on. And he started to give me details about his experiences, living where we did. Remember, we lived deep in the woods in rural Pennsylvania. So, and he was kind of a closeted, married gay man. So, dealing with that and what it was like for him, and then kind of finding a couple gay friends in the jail, actually. He met a group of gay men. They called themselves the ladies, and they walked around. They had a recess time where they would walk around the field. And, so that was good for him. And, he was in jail for 4 years. And during that time, it's very traumatic for me. I mean, having your dad in jail is really traumatic. And I have a lot of empathy for kids and families that are dealing with family members that are incarcerated. It's so hard, and it's hard to imagine until it happens to you. And weirdly, my brain dealt with it. Like I felt like I was fine, and I would tell people like, "Oh, I'm fine." It's hard, but I'm fine. But like I was having nightmares every night. Like I would have these horrible nightmares. And the nightmares were like sometimes about my dad being in jail, but sometimes they were just like about snakes or like weird nightmares. But as soon as my dad was released from jail, years and years later, the nightmares stopped. So I realized then, oh, I was having like a lot of nightmares because that was my brain's way of dealing with the stress of my dad being in jail, and I didn't even realize it. But of course, my mom also had to deal with the fact that her husband of 30 years was suddenly in jail and gay, and it was in the newspaper that he had paid for sex with young men and teenage boy, and it was all made up by the police, but it was in the newspaper, and it was embarrassing for my mom and just really heartbreaking for her. And I, of course, felt terrible about that. So, like, on one hand, I wanted to support my dad coming out as gay and help him be his full self and reach his potential. On the other hand, I wanted to be there for my mom as well. I've always felt a little bit like in a parental role to my parents for some reason. I don't know why, but I always kind of felt that. And now it was really, really the case that I was in a parental role, especially with my dad. My mom kind of shocked me and just like pulled it together, like got the divorce lawyer, sold the house, moved into town, the town where I switched high schools and went. She ended up moving to that town, and her sisters and family lived there. So she had the strong support of her sisters and her mom during that really awful time for her. And when my dad was missing, obviously that was hard for her too, just sitting there alone in the mountain without anyone. Um, so it was like just all around really traumatic. But here we are. My dad finally got out of jail. It was difficult because to get out of jail as a sex offender, and he's still on the sex offender list, you to get out of jail, you have to get approved with a housing plan. There's not a lot of people out there that want to give a sex offender a home. So it took a while, 80 applications for him to get approved for a place to live. And then um, meanwhile, my mom was kind of getting settled in her new home and retired and all of that stuff along the way. So now they're both, really comfortable, settled, retired. My dad has some gay friends, still lives in rural, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And he's like completely openly gay now and came to visit me in San Francisco and met my gay friends. That was that was a great experience to be able to share my queer life with him. And I think we're closer now than we've ever been because now it's like there's no secret, there's no barrier, and like he's able to be open and expressive to me about his feelings and his life and all of that. We can just be like so much more open about everything.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Let's talk more about your sense of purpose of sharing story. At what point in your life did you realize that is your purpose? Or is this something that you look back on and now you realize?
It's something I look back on and realize that was always there. So, like I said, I always was a storyteller and a campaigner. And one of the other things that I realized around storytelling, and this is something that connects my spirituality. my purpose around storytelling, my activism, is that oftentimes the most oppressed people, or the people who society pushes away the most, or the people who have suffered the most, are the ones who have the most rich, full lessons to teach us. And I definitely learned that working at Transgender Law Center. I learned so much from transgender women because they have such a full, rich experience in life. And and there's actually religious traditions out there. I don't want to get too woo-woo, but there are multiple religions out there, faiths out there, that view trans and non-binary people as godlike or angels, or gifted in some way. And I have to say, I believe it to be true. I I can't say I've learned more from any other community than the trans people that I've met, and I can't put my finger on that. But if you even look at like the Bible and Jesus, and look at who Jesus befriended, it was the poor, it was the sex workers, it was people with disabilities, or illness, and they were amazing teachers in the Bible, and they were the ones that he focused on befriending and hanging out with, and serving and focusing a lot of energy towards. And and I think that's an important lesson for all of us, that if we're not prioritizing the people who are most oppressed, then we're not doing things right in society, or at work, or wherever in our lives.
Yeah, it's kind of like they're put on earth to help give us some sort of challenge to push ourselves to be better
Hmm.
people, you know? So I want to touch upon this topic. So let's say someone who's listening really resonated with your story and your description of your purpose of sharing story, and they want to get into this sort of career so they can live and work their purpose. What kind of advice would you give them?
Great question. There's a lot of ways to get involved in the power of storytelling. There are many different ways. I mean, you can go to get involved in speakers bureaus. There's a lot of speakers bureaus out there. A lot of nonprofits out there do different kinds of speakers bureaus if you want to share your own story or help others. There's also speech kind of groups like Toastmasters. I've never done it, but Toastmasters helps you learn how to give a speech. And then there's tons of YouTube and Coursera and all of those kinds of things that you can learn: public relations, marketing, media relations, and then just straight up storytelling. It's becoming more and more of a thing. Now, when I look at, when I got my job, like, storytelling was a big part of what it was as a communications manager. So there's a lot of jobs out there that literally say storytelling in the description. And so there are many, probably at the job, if you already have a job right now, there might even be people at your job whose job it is to do storytelling. And you could probably work with them and talk to them about what they do and how they've done it. Um, Also, I think even LinkedIn has storytelling resources. There are lots of YouTube ones where you could literally search like how to tell a good story, what makes a good story, the power of a good story. There are actually elements that you can learn to tell a quality story so that it has a solid beginning, middle, and end, so that it has an emotional pull, so that you keep people's attention, so there's a strong call to action, or whatever the case may be. So it is an art form that you can refine, and it's a skill that you can continue to improve throughout your entire life. And there's really a plethora of resources out there.
Great, thank you. Now, now it's time to go into the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a bunch of
Hmm.
short questions and you can answer with just one word or a sentence.
Hmm.
You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. So what is one thing you like to do to relax?
One thing I like to do to relax is, oh no, there's so many. I really love to watch the sunset every
Mm,
day.
Uh, what's one thing you like to do for fun?
I love skincare, makeup, beauty, all of that stuff. It's a form of self-care for me. I love it.
And what is one habit you are working on?
Ending, well, okay, I shouldn't say ending something. I'm really working hard on reducing my cyclical thoughts. So cyclical thought patterns, or what some people might call worrying. That's something I've been dealing with my whole life, and I've really made a lot of progress this year in that regard. And it's been really rewarding, and I do that through meditation. I am using some psychoactive drug therapy, and um, and also I've reduced a lot of my commitments and different things in my life that used to cause worry, external things that I used to allow to cause me to kind of worry a lot more. So really reducing that worry is a big goal of mine in the past year, and I'm still working on that. And I'm trying to complain less.
Nice. What's one habit you would like to add in 2021?
I would like to get better at waking up early, going to bed early. It really is true for me anyway, that if I can do it, once I start doing it, it feels so good. It's amazing how good it feels.
If you're not doing what you are doing today, what would you be doing?
In my career, I could imagine myself being a psychologist or a social worker, or even an entertainer of some sort.
Hmm.
But if I had the choice of be doing anything right now, I would be somewhere where there's a lot of beach and nature.
Mm-hmm. Me too. How would you describe your ideal life?
It would involve close friends and family, chosen or otherwise, animals and nature.
And how do you define purpose?
It's the thing in your solar plexus area that you can feel in that part of your body that gives you drive, that makes you feel motivated to get up in the morning and do things, that brings you joy and makes you feel empowered and makes other people feel empowered, hopefully.
And are there any last requests you would like our listeners to do?
Hmm. Yes. Like I said earlier, I think, I'm one of you listeners out there who, I understand, like, some of us feel a little lost in life, or we're looking for answers. Or so number one, don't feel ashamed if you don't have one goal or purpose in life. It's okay. It's okay to have more than one. It's okay to not know what one is right away. And just think about what brings you joy in life and what brings you peace in life. I definitely recommend gratitude, breathing. Some of the most basic lessons in life are really what it comes down to, is the compassion and the kindness and being in nature and breathing and letting go of your phone.
Thank you for sharing all of that, and thank you for being a part of a working purpose and sharing your story and your purpose with us.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here. I'm so excited to see how the podcast grows, and I'm a huge fan. I can't wait to hear everybody else's interviews.
The key takeaways from this episode is that things do get better. If you're bullied, lonely, or are in unsafe environments to be yourself, do seek out someone you can safely reach out to for support. This support is crucial as you navigate the rough waters of life. And also find your own story, but not just any story. Make your story an empowering one. And the last key takeaway is to try to seek out other people's stories as well. Understand the common humanity that we share. I hope this interview with Mark Snyder has inspired you in some ways to search within yourself so you can ignite and reach your own purpose. If you would like to hear more and to support this podcast, please subscribe. Please tell your friends about it and rate it 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. Please also follow A Working Purpose on Instagram and join our Facebook group. You have my deepest gratitude for listening. May your present moment, now and forever, be filled with light and love. Until next time, this is Wing, and you are listening to A Working Purpose.